Critical thinking versus analytical thinking can be mistaken for the same thing, but they are indeed different. Critical thinking is the process of reasoning through information, concepts, or data that are acquired by sensory experience. Analytical thinking is the type of thought that typically centers on problem solving in many areas. Analytical thinking can be applied in various ways to solve problems in science, social relationships, personal life, and so on. Critical thinking versus analytical thinking. The difference between critical thinking and analytical or logical thought is that one focuses on what outside sources think about something, while the other relies solely on one's own opinions. Critical thinking can lead to alternative viewpoints and open up new ideas, whereas analytical thinking tends to lead the thinker down a singular path of reason. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking, also critical analysis, is the objective examination and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. It's done with the goal of determining what is true, false, or somewhere in between. Critical thinking has 3 stages. 1. Identify the claim. Identifying the claim means that you are identifying the claim that someone is making. It does not matter if it is true or not, what matters is understanding the claim. You can make a claim by giving examples to support your point or saying something along these lines. What I mean is, my opponent is wrong because, etc. 2. Form a framework for evaluation. Once you have identified the claim, it will be important to form a framework for evaluation. This is the step where you are assigning meaning to different aspects of an argument. It's important to go beyond just telescoping or generalizing sentences into conclusions that can be used as an argument. For example, if someone says something like, "All men are terrible," it would be easy to generalize this statement and say that all men are terrible people. Of course, not all men would agree. Still, if you pay attention to the context, e.g., audience, story, etc., you could say that the speaker is making the generalization but in a specific context, maybe in response to something he said in his previous statement. 3. Evaluate the evidence. This is the step where you take a closer look at the pieces of information put forward to support a claim. You should use criteria that show that a piece of evidence is valid or not. This is where you connect the dots between pieces of evidence and see whether they fit together to support an argument or not. The goal here is to evaluate all available information and form your own opinion about what was said in your analysis. What is analytical thinking? Analytical thinking, or thinking analytically, is making sense of data and information and finding patterns and rules in it. It's generally considered to be the opposite of critical thinking. This is because one of the core differences between critical and analytical thinking is that the critical style of thought looks at what's outside of oneself to assess an issue, while the analytical style focuses on oneself to analyze an issue. Analytical thinking is a process of analyzing information, patterns, trends, statistics, arguments, logic, and so on with the goal of finding solutions and making informed decisions. It can be applied in various fields like computer programming, to logically solve problems, business, to make difficult decisions, and so on. Analytical thinking also explains why some people are so successful in their fields. For example, successful corporate leaders are often described as being analytical thinkers. Analytical thinking involves the use of logic to find solutions to problems in all aspects of life, including science, technology, society, business, and management. Analytical versus critical thinking, the differences. There are several differences between these two types of thinking, and they are as follows. 1. Attention. Analytical thinking is based on paying attention to information, while critical thinking is based on paying attention to outside sources that provide information. For example, if you are a business leader, you should analyze data from your business to make informed business decisions, which requires analytical thinking. A teacher, on the other hand, should pay attention to the students' responses and generalize those into a broader concept that will be taught next, which requires critical thinking. 2. Attention to detail. Analytical thinking requires paying attention to detail, which means that the analysis is done at a very close level. This is necessary because it's the best way to detect patterns and relationships. For example, if you are trying to find out where people are going on any given weekend, you could ask them what they are doing, or you could analyze their credit card transactions over the course of a 2-week period. The former would require critical thinking, while the latter would require analytical thinking. 3. Verbal ability. Analytical thinking requires verbal ability, and one has to be able to explain and back up the reason for the analytical thinking. The person analyzing must be able to explain why certain patterns or relationships exist in his data. For example, you can see analytic thinking in an article about an invention that explains how the author came up with such a new device. It would require critical thinking, however, if you were evaluating such an invention and trying to determine whether it would work or not. 4. Logical reasoning. Analytical thinking requires logical reasoning, which means that the person analyzing must be able to summarize all of his findings and identify all of the patterns. Of course, this is not an easy task. It's not something that just anyone can do, especially if they are already overburdened with work. An analytical thinker should be able to find relationships between different sets of data, which requires logical reasoning. Analytical thinking is very important in fields where there are many variables. It's also important in business, so being able to think analytically is essential when it comes to decision making. The ability to make good decisions is often based on the ability to win the battle of the numbers. Analytical thinking is also important in fields like science and health because it's necessary for making good decisions. For example, if you are a doctor, you should be able to analyze data from patients and come up with a diagnosis that would apply to all patients. In other fields, analytical thinking is very useful for solving problems that need careful interpretation, such as solving a math problem. 5. Problem solving. While both analytical and critical thinking involves problem solving, each type of thinking requires a different approach. Critical thinking typically involves outside information such as scientific research, past case studies, and so on, while analytical thinking involves internal analysis such as review of data and information. Analytical thinking is best defined as a type of thinking that involves logical reasoning, problem solving, and careful analysis. This type of thinking is also known as deductive reasoning. It's a very important skill in mathematics, for example, because many mathematicians use analytical thinking to solve problems. Analytical thinking is also very useful in the field of science because it's required when studying a reaction/reaction sequence, substance/substance reaction, and so on. This type of thinking is also known as inductive reasoning. Analytical thinking differs from critical thinking in that it's a process of analyzing information, patterns, trends, statistics, and so on, while critical thinking is a thought process that involves outside influences such as scientific research and so on. Critical thinkers are more likely to use inductive reasoning because they pay less attention to detail and more attention to outside influences. Analytical thinking is the best way to get the most from life. It's best to analyze things in great detail before taking any kind of action. Analytical thinking is important in understanding how the world around us works, including science, religion, politics, and so on. It's also very useful for making decisions that categorize people into groups, and then you can efficiently market to them. Analytical thinking is often the basis for good decision making because it requires gathering data and analyzing patterns to make an informed decision. Analytical thinking is the best way to identify patterns because it gives you complete control over the situation. It's also important because you can apply the information gained to make other decisions. Analytical thinking is also necessary because analysis requires you to be able to break things down into their simplest form, which is clearly useful when building a house or working on other type of projects. 6. Independence. Analytical thinking requires independence, which means that the person analyzing must be able to remain unbiased. An analytical thinker is likely to have a neutral situation because he is more likely to focus on data, rather than the personalities involved. It's important for analytical thinkers because you need to be able to study complex problems without getting swayed by emotions or outside influences. Analytical thinking is also important for making good decisions because it allows you to see things from different angles. Analytical versus critical thinking, the similarities. Analytical thinking is a great way to solve problems because it requires critical thinking, problem solving, and logical reasoning. However, it's easy to think that analytical thinking is a process of critically analyzing information and thoughtfully applying the best solution. It's very important to consider the different aspects of analytical versus critical thinking when deciding which one is better for you or how you can apply them most effectively. The goal is to pick the approach that works best for you and the academic/work environment you're in. Analytical thinking involves applying your knowledge, skills, and experience to a problem. It requires a thorough analysis of the situation, which is why many business people rely on analytical thinking when it comes to decision making. Analytical thinking also requires logical reasoning, problem solving, and careful analysis. Critical thinking is a great way to analyze information, grasp complex concepts, and make decisions based on logic. It's also the best way to identify patterns because it involves outside influences. Critical thinking involves varying outside information, which is why many critical thinkers are often involved in scientific research or college courses. Critical thinkers are more likely to use inductive reasoning because they pay less attention to detail and more attention to outside influences. Conclusion: there are many differences between analytical and critical thinking, but both types of thinking are necessary for success in college and work. Most people need to use both types of thinking, so it's important to learn which type works best for you and the situations you face. Analytical thinking is best defined as a type of thinking that involves logical reasoning, problem solving, and careful analysis. Critical thinking is also a great way to analyze things effectively because it involves breaking down complex problems into smaller parts. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, subscribe, and more importantly, share. Thanks for listening to Mind by Design.